Welcome everybody to today's session of the Jane Family Institute's Social Wealth Seminar, which is our ongoing semi-monthly forum exploring strategies to manage public assets and resources in service of a more just society in the United States and across the world. Today we are really privileged to welcome Marcelo Medeiros, who, though he is joining us from New York City, is going to be speaking about a different part of the world, about Latin America. Before telling you, though, about today's presentation, just some really quick introductory words. I should introduce myself. My name's Paul Katz, and I am Vice President for Special Projects at the Jane Family Institute. We are an applied research organization in the social sciences, and we work on a variety of projects, especially around digital ethics, higher income financing, and guaranteed income. And in addition to the Social Wealth Seminar and events that we organize, previously in our office and now via Zoom, and we also have some really excellent publications. We have a weekly newsletter. If you're not subscribed, I highly recommend it. And we have a great blog called Phenomenal World, which I think is really, has something for basically anyone who's interested in any aspect of the social sciences. So if you have not, check it out. So today we will be spending the next 25 minutes or so hearing from our speaker, from Marcelo Medeiros, about the topic of his presentation, which is entitled Beyond Formal Workers, Expanding Social Protection in Latin America. And then we'll follow this presentation with time for discussion. So I'll ask, if you have questions, please hold them until the end, unless they are clarifications, in which case feel free to put them in the chat, and Marcelo can opt to address them during the presentation if you would like. I'll also note that we're recording this session and we'll be posting a lightly edited version to our YouTube channel after. So if you want to ensure that you don't appear in the recording at all, please do turn off your camera. So that's really kind of all we have for preliminary information. I do want to note very quickly, actually, that though this is an ongoing seminar series, unfortunately, we've had a recent cancellation, so I'm not able to announce what the next session will be. But the positive spin on this is that we really do have the opportunity to welcome speakers that perhaps anyone present has really been eager to hear from. So if you have someone in mind, please do reach out. If you're here, I think it means you have my email address. All right, so now moving on to the meat of the day, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Marcelo Medeiros. Medeiros is currently a visiting professor at Princeton University. He's also a professor at the University of Brasilia and a senior researcher at the Brazilian Institute for Applied Economic Research. His research focuses on social inequalities. He has served as a policy expert at the Brazilian Audit Court, the TCU, Brasilia, and as an advisor for the Brazilian National Science Council. He's also a member of the Brazilian Society for the Advancement of Science, the International Sociological Association, and the Brazilian Sociological Society. And with that, I'm very excited to turn it over to Marcelo.
Hi. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I feel very honored by being invited here. Let me begin telling a little bit about how the current Latin American social protection systems were established. They were established between the 1920s and the 1960s. And they are all contribution-based at that time, if not all, most of it. And by being contribution-based, that means that they depend on contributions from formal workers. So they are restricted to those belonging to the formal market, which actually are a minority in Latin America. They always have been a minority in Latin America. And it depends very much on the country, but usually they're less than half of the labor force. Sometimes they go up to 40% of the labor force, but they usually actually more than 60, 65, more than 2/3 of the labor force, or the informal workers are more than 2/3 of the labor force. So formal workers will be about like 1/3 of the population usually. It depends very much. It varies from country to country, of course. Well, when a social protection system is based on contribution, it tends to replicate previous inequalities. And that is very clear when you think about the pension system, which is based on contributions as well. If you contribute more to pensions, of course, you end up receiving more pensions when you retire. That also is very clear in the case of Latin American countries. When you look at the health systems, except for Costa Rica and Brazil, if you take the Americas, except for Canada, Brazil, and Costa Rica, all countries have segmented health systems, meaning that if you belong to a certain professional category, then you have access to a certain type of hospitals. So, say if you're from the military, then you have access to the hospitals for the military. But if you are from, the metal workers, then you have to go to the hospitals to the metal workers. It's a little bit more sophisticated than this, but that was very much the initial design of the systems, and we inherited this today. Like, we tend to replicate this model, and this model replicates inequalities, because if you belong to a high income category, then you tend to have better services, better social protection, and so on. And same goes if you belong to a lower income category, or if you are not a formal worker, which means that you're probably not going to have any access to anything. There are exceptions, like there's always primary healthcare in Latin America for free and so on. But I'm just giving an overview of how those things work. Well, the first problem with a contribution-based system is that it replicates pre-existing inequalities. That's the first problem. And then Latin America came to the year 2000 without protecting the large majority of its population, because it was protecting initially, because of that type of design, essentially protecting formal workers, who are actually at the top of the distribution, not at the bottom of the distribution. So in the 2000s and early 2000s, some countries in Latin America, particularly Mexico and Brazil, they started implementing social systems in the form, in the case of Mexico and Brazil, in the form of conditional cash transfers, which were not so conditional at that time, or they've never been very conditional. Conditional cash transfers means that you receive the transfer if you adopt a certain behavior. But they were not really conditional in the sense that if people don't adopt that behavior, they will be excluded to the program. I mean, it varies, but usually there will be lots of, ways of going around those too strict impositions. And in some cases, like the case of Brazil, the main conditionality was to attend school. Kids had to attend school, but the school attendance was up to 95% of the time those programs began. So actually, they never been really a conditionality. They're being much more acted as a political lubricant, because nobody would be against a program that imposes conditionality, has some type of morality behind it, and so on and so forth. I don't want to get into that. I just want to say that beginning in the decade of the 2000s, Latin America began to have a broader social assistance that was not dependent on contributions, and also began having social assistance that actually was targeted. So it was actually protecting the bottom of your population. The total proportion of the population being protected by those programs varies. It varies from 5 to 25% of the population, depends on the country as well. Actually, some countries have even lower than 5, but still. Let's make it from 5 to 25 just for an approximation. So we're talking about less than 1/4 of the population being protected at the bottom. This protection is not very strong in the sense that those programs are not very much poverty eradication programs. They don't eradicate poverty. They only alleviate poverty in the sense that they give you a contribution, but a transfer, but the transfer is not sufficient to move the family receiving the transfer above the poverty lines. So they actually alleviation problems, but still they exist. They protect a share of the population. In between this 1/4 and the bottom 1/4, or perhaps the bottom 1/3 of the population, and the top 1/3 of the population, there is a huge gap. There is a unknown middle. There is an invisible middle, actually, that is not even known. We as policymakers, we don't even know who they are. We don't have registries. We don't have any kind of map. We have very limited information about them, and they are extremely hard to reach. So this is particularly problematic because, first, you have a huge amount of population in Latin America that has no coverage. And that cannot receive coverage if needed. And why is this a concern? Because I don't believe, I am entirely convinced by others that we will face new crises very soon. You know, all the conditions for a new pandemic are set. And by this, I say that we can have a pandemic that it can be even worse than this one. I mean, we've gone through a bad pandemic, but it's not so bad. And who knows which next pandemic is coming. So, but all the conditions are set, you know, globalization, free travel, frequent travel, mass farming for food production, which puts thousands of birds in contact with each other in a very confined space. Environmental pressure, you know, people moving into urbanizing areas that were previously rural, and so on. So all the conditions for a new pandemic are set, and everything points in the direction that we're going to have a new one. We had pandemics before in Latin America. We had chikungunya, and then we had dengue, and then Zika virus, and we have the Nile fever in the US. And so, you know, the conditions are set for new pandemics for coming, and, you know, perhaps not being pandemic in the sense that we're seeing there's a global pandemic, but new epidemics are certainly coming in the future. Even if they don't come in the future, there's a second thing that will be coming for sure, which is environmental crisis. It's 100% sure that we will have crisis. An environmental crisis usually is not as large in terms of geographic coverage as an epidemic, but it implies a flood in the city or a drought in a large area. It implies all sorts of problems, and we're going to have them for sure. And by this, I mean that we should start being prepared for the next crisis, because there will be a next one. And in order to prepare for a next crisis, we have to make plans about one thing that we always need in a large-scale crisis, which is social mobilization. In order to face a large-scale crisis, we need some type of cooperation, collective cooperation, social mobilization, or collective mobilization. And in order to get that mobilization, you have to ensure that people are being protected. Otherwise, they will have to adopt individualistic behaviors so they can protect themselves. And by adopting totally individualistic behaviors, they will not take part in the collective actions. So in order to have them, to create the conditions for, you know, your population, be the population of the city or population of a state or a country or even, you know, the entire region, to cooperate, we have to create the conditions for this cooperation to occur. And creating those conditions include, it's not limited to, but include providing social protection to people. And it is very clear in the case of COVID-19, because if you don't, for instance, if you don't make transfers, if you don't build a social protection net, and if you don't ensure that people don't have to work, they will go working. And if they go to work, they will spread the virus. And actually, we learned with the COVID-19 that the very survival of the rich depends on the social protection of the poor. It's more than a matter of justice. It's a matter of collective organization, social structuring. So we should be prepared for the next crisis, or even if we're not only concerned about the next crisis, at least we should be prepared to change some aspects in this social policy model that was almost entirely based on contributions until recently, until 20 years ago. And I have been thinking about this, and one of my concerns is that the current system of protection, it's either dependent on contributions or cyclical, in the sense that if the economy goes well, you have funds for social protection or a social safety net for cash transfers, let's say so. But if the economy does not go well, you don't have the funds, because actually you're taking the funds from the budget, and the budget is entirely dependent on tax collection, and tax collection is dependent on the performance of the economy. So in the case of a recession, actually your collection reduces, and if your collection reduces, naturally or understandably, your funds for social protection also reduce. But this is the problem, because a recession is precisely the moment that you need social protection more than ever. Think of unemployment insurance. During a recession is the time that you have to spend more money with employment insurance. But by being cyclical, by depending on the budget, this creates a trap. When you need social protection more is when you have less. And this is precisely what happened in the case of Bolsa Familia in Brazil. Brazil had a very deep recession in 2016. And instead of expanding the program to face the recession and protect the poor, because poverty simply skyrocketed at the time, instead of expanding the protection, actually what the Brazilian government did, it reduced the size of Bolsa Familia. Bolsa Familia declined in size during a recession and actually declined even during the recovery. It was precisely the opposite of what was expected from any social protection system. So I've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about what we could do. And to be very frank, I think we should be taking advantage of the better tools we have now, and they're better than the tools we had 20 years ago when Bolsa Familia or Oportunidades or Progressa or Chile Solidario, whatever, just name the program, before when those programs were being implemented. So I think we need to think about two basic infrastructures. One is a operational infrastructure, which I am not going to discuss extensively here, but I can talk about it if you want. And the second one is the fiscal infrastructure, or the funding, if you wish, to implement something like perhaps, I'm concerned about implementing the infrastructure of the social protection system. I am not exactly concerned with the actual transfers or the actual protection. I think that we should first establish the infrastructure, and then according to the budgetary capacity or according to the fiscal possibilities at the moment, then you expand or don't expand the program. Including, I'm thinking about establishing an infrastructure that could absorb a flexible program, such as a program that during a crisis, a program enters into action and transfers money, but after the crisis, you can just like close your safety net and just make new reserves for the next eventual crisis. That, of course, we all hope it doesn't happen, but it will probably. So better be safe than sorry. Just to mention three things that I believe we should keep in mind when designing the operational infrastructure. We have to care about three types of inclusion. The first one is documental inclusion, because large shares of the Latin American population is still not documented. It still doesn't have a, say, individual taxpayer number or a social security number or any other types of documentations. And that's totally feasible because countries as large as India are being able to implement digital IDs, and also small countries been doing the same thing. But if you're doing something in a country as large as India with less capacity than a share of the countries in Latin America, I don't see any reasons for not doing the same thing in Latin America, especially because some countries have already implemented biometric identification, which is the case of Brazil, for instance. Brazil has biometric identification of a very large share of its population because it did biometric identification for voting and registration. So you register the voters using biometric information. So if Brazil did this, and Brazil is in this case, it's not on Brazil, it's a specific agency that takes care of voting process and so on. If they were capable of doing this, now you think of a large federal government, using the full power of the executive. It could be done as well. We have the technology for doing that. It is a simple technology, and it is very good for people to have some type of clear documents and identification. It's so good that all of us have it. So also, I think we should be first one thing. Then is think about documental inclusion. The second one is financial inclusion, and the third one would be digital inclusion. And I'm going to go very quickly through this because I don't have to spend my time on this. I want to talk a little bit more about the creating a sovereign fund. But again, with respect to financial inclusion, it is estimated, it depends, it varies from country to country, but it is estimated that at least half of the poorest half of the Latin American population have no access at all of any banking, financial, whatever service, any type of service of that, any service of that type. And of course, this is not desirable. It should be, financial inclusion should be understood as a, in my view, as a social policy, because it is so important to promote your current life depends so much on financial inclusion in so many aspects, that we should take this seriously, especially because the costs of promoting financial inclusion are very low, and Kenya just included about 90% of its population. And Kenya didn't start from a point as good as the point that Latin America currently is now. Latin America has a very good banking system because it had very high inflation, and very high inflation created very good banking systems. So it's already an advantage that should be used, and do whatever Kenya did, but Kenya is just an example, but we should care about including people financially. And finally, Latin Americans should care more about digital inclusion, and it is very clear now the importance of this in all dimensions of life. In case of a crisis, if you have financial inclusion of people can be identified, they can communicate, they can use public services, they can have access to health, telehealth, or they can have access to education, teleeducation. You may not like the idea of having education, via internet. I don't like it either, but anyway, it is better than not having anything during a crisis. So this is a third thing. Those three inclusions, actually, they're better. They're very good for facing the crisis, but actually very useful for the normal life as well. So, and they are three very cheap things to do. In my view, they're totally feasible in a time frame of maybe 2, 3, 5, maybe no more than 10 years. It would be, I'm guessing here a little bit because I'm not discussing any specific plan, but I think this could be done for perhaps 75% of the Latin American populations within 10 years. And it does not cost a huge amount of money because we're not setting up a transfer system. We're not setting up a social protection system. We're just setting up the infrastructure. And you use that infrastructure for transfers if the government wants or not. It's a decision, it's a secondary decision. The thing is that if the government decides to make the transfers, it depends on the infrastructure. So you need the infrastructure to use it or not. It's like having the fire services or the emergency service. It's like having an analogy is not so good, but it's like having an army. You have the army and you have the choice of using or not using it. So, but you depend on that in the case of if you want to face a crisis. Or, well, maybe I should be speaking about the firemen and all the things. It's less bellic, but anyway. And I am concerned about the infrastructure. That's the operational infrastructure, but I want to speak a little bit about the fiscal infrastructure, the infrastructure necessary to ensure that the funding would be possible. That during a crisis, there will be no lack of funds to face the crisis, meaning that what happened to Bolsa Familia could be avoided. And I think the solution for that is to create some type of sovereign fund. A fund, some people prefer to call this a rainy day fund. I don't like the term, but anyway, it is the same thing if you want. A fund that is prepared to be used in case of need. And in order to create the fund, create this fund, you have to understand that this is a counter-cyclical measure. A fund is like a saving account, and you have the savings account, and then you use the savings account in case of need. You don't use that regularly. You have to keep feeding the fund regularly, perhaps with money from the treasury, or perhaps using money from other things, like some countries in Norway used the revenues from oil to feed the fund. But I can also imagine some states in the U.S. use tax money to feed their funds, the rainy days funds. And since it's a social protection fund, it doesn't matter where the money is coming from in a broad sense. What matters is that you build the fund, and the decision of how much to put in the fund, how big the fund will be, those are secondary decisions. I think they're extremely important. They have to be taken. They have to be decided taking into account the potential needs you may have, because like depending on how much time you want to be able to keep social protection functioning in the case of need, and then of course you have to prepare in advance for that. But what it is very clear to me that we should be prepared in the sense of having the sovereign fund that could be used in the case of need. And this is nothing new. Now, countries have funds, states in the US have funds for those situations. The IMF recommended strongly countries in the Eurozone to have a sovereign fund to face financial crisis, which is different. But I'm just saying that, well, if you should have a fund for financial crisis, why not a fund for social crisis, let's say so. So that's very much the idea. That's the first thing. In order to have a fund like that, you have to build the governance infrastructure. You have to build the governance, a very strong governance infrastructure, because otherwise those funds will be used for political reasons. You know, the year before the elections, you declare that the minimal crisis is a huge crisis, and then you use the funds, and of course, you know, people will see the whoever is using the fund, the candidates, as let's say protectors and so on, and that is profitable in the political sense. So there should be a governance system that at least has two principles, attends to principles. First, independence, and the same way we think of independent central banks, we should have an independent social bank or independent social fund. And second, it also should be driven by targets, in the same way that your financial sectors have inflation targets, you know, central banks have inflation targets, or they have exchange rate targets or bands. We also should have social targets that would give somehow objective way of this. I'm not being over technocratic here, but targets would give an objective way of deciding, an independent way of deciding as well, when the funds should be used, with, of course, triggers that will be open in the case of exception, and perhaps you should mobilize the Congress to open those triggers. And it depends, to pull the triggers, and it depends very much on the way the funds are designed. And apart from the funds, there is a second thing that I believe is important, is that most Latin American countries now are implementing some austerity mechanisms. Essentially, there are some mechanisms that control public expenditure, and I don't see this as essentially negative. I think the devil is in the details, and the problem is not having a protection against excessive spending. The problem is how those mechanisms are designed, and I think that those mechanisms would be much better designed if they were designed to include some triggers in case of social, special social needs, like a crisis like COVID. And some of them include triggers for large-scale crises, such as the COVID crisis. But suppose that instead of having a large-scale pandemic, that requires mobilization of the Congress to release the austerity measures, suppose that you have a crisis in a city, a flood. The Congress would not release, that would be not politically sufficient to mobilize the Congress, and the Congress would not decide to release funds to face that specific flood. So we would leave lots of people without protection because of the lack of political capital to mobilize a change or to declare an emergency. So a special funds could be used. And I think that if there is a fund that is designed in a better way with a independent governance body, those decisions will be much easier to make. All right. Yeah, maybe I should stop here and listen to people. Maybe they have better ideas than I do.
Well, thank you so much, Marcelo. I think that was really a fantastic presentation of your proposal, and I think, a really great invitation to further conversation. So I suspect that, many of us are going to have questions or comments. As always, I've been making notes as we've been going, and I've got my list of questions myself. But I've already done plenty of talking, so I'd love to give people maybe a few seconds to collect their thoughts. And as you do this, just a couple kind of instructions about asking questions. So if you have a question to share, you can just let us know by saying I have a question in the chat, the public chat to everyone. And then I'll call on you, and it would be great if you would unmute yourself, and also feel free to activate your video if you would like, but then of course you will appear in the recording. If you'd like to be completely anonymous, you can just type your question into the chat in its entirety and let me know you'd like me to read it, and I'll do it without mentioning your name. So those are two different options. And I'll just ask, if you are comfortable being identified, when you do ask your question, it would be really great if you could preface it with just a phrase or two about who you are. And of course, your name would be really cool too. So all of that being said, does anyone have a question to start us off? We'll wait a couple seconds here, see if anyone jumps in. Okay, well, I've performed deference, so now I will just go ahead and ask my first question. But again, please, as I'm going, do jump into the chat if you'd like to put yourself in the queue. So I guess that my kind of first and sort of biggest question is, how do you see this relating to discussions about like basic income, for instance? This is obviously something that we at JFI have been thinking a lot about, that I think many people on this call, including many in Brazil who've been working on the experience of Maricá, have been thinking a lot about. It's kind of at a time when so many people are pushing for a sort of permanent system, that will be not temporarily limited in the way that your kind of crisis response system would be. Sort of, do you see those as complementary, or is it a question kind of priorities, and you think it's important to have a crisis response system first? Or, I mean, just basically, how do these concepts relate in your mind?
Sure. Should I, or you want to like make a bundle of questions and I answer it? Up to you.
Well, I mean, in the past we've gone one by one, and I think it's worked
one by one.
Well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, just again, I just follow orders here. What I am discussing here is not exactly the transfer system. I'm discussing here the infrastructure, the foundations of any system that uses cash transfers specifically. I mean, it could be other things as well, but I'm more concerned about the cash transfers. So it's not necessarily a system designed for emergencies. I'm emphasizing that we will have emergencies, and we need a system in place. But actually, we could perfectly use the same infrastructure to have a basic income, to implement a large-scale basic income transfer. Essentially, I'm thinking that first, basic income systems, basic income programs will be dependent on the budget. If the economy goes into recession, you will have to cut that budget. Unless you establish that as a legal right, in the sense that people will get that anyway, which is hard to do. And even being an illegal right, you can block it somehow, depending on the size of the crisis and the type of government that's in power. So if you create a fund, you can stand the recession much better. Again, the example, very easy to understand, is the recession of 2016 in Brazil. Bolsa Familia, which is the equivalent of it's not a basic, universal basic income, but it's like a regular income that was coming from the budget, was reduced in size during a recession because it's cyclical. So in order to create something that's non-cyclical, we depend on different mechanisms. And the different mechanisms I'm discussing here is essentially a sovereign fund that has independent governance to decide when the fund was going to be used, essentially if the regular budget is not coming, then we use the funds. That's essentially the idea, and it works with the same way. It doesn't depend. I am concerned with an infrastructure that is independent of the type of cash transfers that would be set up in the future. The infrastructure will be good for a permanent transfer system or for a temporary emergential transfer system. would be good for a universal transfer system or for a targeted system. It doesn't depend. So the idea is that the two things, the operational dimension and the operational infrastructure, financial inclusion, documental inclusion, digital inclusion, and the fiscal infrastructure, the fund and the governance system, they would both be useful for a universal basic income, for a non-universal but large-scale basic income, or they would be useful for a highly targeted program as you have in Latin America. All those programs would be, all those measures or those policies will be profiting from a better infrastructure.
Oh, that makes so much sense. And I see we have other questions mounting, but I do, I'm still going to indulge myself with just a really quick follow-up, just to ask, thinking then about the nature of the transfer itself. I mean, do you have a preference? What's in your ideal world? What would this infrastructure be used for?
The type of transfer? No, I think we should create first. We should be prepared for next crisis. So we should create, it doesn't depend on what we do. We should prepare to have an emergency system, a system that expands and it retracts in case of need, because that will cost a lot of money. That's not sustainable in the long run. You cannot keep the transfers you're making. Not all countries in Latin America are making transfers, but some countries in Latin America are making transfers. Those transfers are not sustainable. You cannot keep them forever because they involve a very large share of the budget, the governmental budget. It's impossible to keep them on. It's not realistic. On the other hand, if we are able to increase the expenditures in Latin America, and we should, in social assistance, be it a conditional cash transfers, non-conditional but targeted cash transfers, or a more universal basic income, which is probably not going to be 100% universal because that would also cost a lot of money, but perhaps universal child benefit or something like that, which is more feasible and fits better the budget. And I don't have a specific preference. I'm concerned about building infrastructure. And I think, of course, if one thing that is clear to me is that we have to expand the current levels of social assistance in Latin America. We spend too little in social assistance. We should be expanding at least twice the current expenditures, which is not impossible because Latin America spends less than 2% of GDP on social assistance. Totally viable to increase the expenditures to maybe 3 or 4% of GDP.
Oh, great! That makes so much sense. Okay, so I'll finally then yield to some of the others who've indicated they have questions here. Kendall, would you like to introduce yourself and ask your question?
Sure thing. Can you hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, thanks so much for the presentation. My name is Kendall. I'm a PhD student in economics in Colorado. And I'm not totally sure how to ask this question because I'm really not familiar with like the legal structure of fiscal policy and public finance in Latin American countries and states. But, you know, you mentioned this, that in the US, we do have a lot of rainy day funds at the state and local level that have pretty like explicit rules around how much money can go in and how much can go out. And anytime there's legislation being debated at the state and city level about, you know, even establishing these, it's really controversial, even though they can only be used for, you know, making up for reductions in tax revenue losses. So I guess my question is, in Latin America, are there countries or states that you think would have an easier route towards establishing this type of infrastructure you're proposing?
No, well, legally speaking, I cannot answer that question because I don't really know. But my guess is that those countries where the expenditure levels are higher, Latin America has a problem. The total, the size of the states in Latin America are too low, too small. So I think those countries that have a larger, better structured states would be more capable, legally speaking, of implementing those measures. But this is just a guess. I'm just guessing. So maybe, Mexico is not so big, but Mexico, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, those countries would be, Colombia perhaps. Central America, I think, would have problems with that, very serious problems.
Great. Well, I see Alex also has a question. Alex, would you like to introduce yourself and ask it?
Sure. I'm Alex Jacobs. I look after strategy and operations here at JFI. Thanks very much for the presentation, which I found quite fascinating. Same caveat as the previous question that I don't know if the same logic necessarily applies in some of the parts of Latin America that you study, but it occurs to me that I think one thing you explained very well is that this kind of counter-cyclical infrastructure that you're describing would ensure that sort of enough real money is in place to cover the spending needed to counter some sort of global event or recession. But one thing I'm kind of attentive to, especially from the US context, is the sort of rhetorical element of all of this, which is that politicians in particular, no matter what necessarily the sort of the account reads or how much money is cash is on hand, will often in situations of recessions or crises say, essentially use the rhetoric of austerity to say, we no longer can afford this. It's irresponsible to be spending what it is that we're spending. And I wonder kind of how much attention you've given to that. Like that seems to me as being a potential obstacle, even in the face of the reality in the sort of like collective bank account, so to speak, that politicians in the crises that you described may well find themselves advocating for and pushing for restrictions on benefits to sort of low-income people, just because there's sort of a strong kind of tradition of doing that on sort of the right side of the aisle.
Okay. Yeah, sure. I totally understand your point, and actually, I'm very concerned with that as well. And I would say that we have this very same problem when we have central banks. Central banks regulate the amount of money in circulation, and if the recession is showing up, then people say, well, maybe central banks should behave differently. And that's why we have independent central banks. So whatever we have, whatever type of funds sovereign funds or whatever, let's say social funds, let's call it social funds. No matter what type of social funds we create, we should create them independent, give them some degree of independence. Independence doesn't mean total independence. It means operational independence. You're still part of the state, so you're still subject to scrutiny, evaluation, auditing, and so on and so forth. But I think the independence here refers more to the decision of when to use the fund and how much of the fund to use to that specific situation.
Great. Well, I see we have a question from Sinoja. Would you like to introduce yourself and ask it?
Sure. Hi, my name is Sinoja. I work at editorial in JFI. So I have a question about, so in Colombia following the pandemic, there was a really huge problem with the ways in which Venezuelan migrants really fell through the traps in terms of like complete lack of social protections, and led to a lot of migrants then returning to Venezuela in these really precarious circumstances during a pandemic. And so I'm curious about the ways in which you could see an infrastructure sort of be able to catch people who are in sort of like complicated migratory situations who may not have access to documentation for various reasons.
Yeah.
Considering when, going back is like incredibly dangerous in the health situation.
I totally agree with you. And this is something that Latin America is totally unprepared to face. Latin America has no migration policy at all. Has out-migration policy, but that doesn't have an immigration policy. And actually, most of the policies are very restrictive in the sense that countries are usually open to highly qualified labor, but not open to low qualified labor or humanitarian migration. So yes, this is something that has to be. We must find ways to care about that. And again, I don't want to keep pushing the idea of infrastructures, but if we have a good knowledge of and a good inclusion of your population, like a good coverage of your current resident population being correctly documented and correctly identified, it becomes much easier to move on and document and identify the migrants. If you don't have the first one, it's going to be extremely hard to do the second one. So in my view, it is on the interest of the migrants to have a population that's currently identified and documented, a resident population that's identified and documented.
Great. Well, I see next up we have a question from Steve, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi. So first, thank you for a wonderful talk. I really appreciate it, and I find myself ever more fascinated by events in Latin America, so I'm excited to get this perspective. one sort of irony of social wealth fund conversations is that they're sort of two very divergent notions of how they interact with crisis. So on the one hand, especially in the developed world, crises are often seen as maybe opportunities to enlarge a social or sovereign wealth fund, because in a country like the United States or the European Union as a whole, during a crisis, there's usually need for fiscal support, and at a national or EU level, sufficient flexibility to use the central bank rather than a pre-existing fund to finance that fiscal support. So if we got into the habit of building social or sovereign wealth funds rather than merely injecting money into the economy for nothing, one frequent proposal is we could use those support moments as opportunities to grow the funds, to the funds that would effectively be to support the economy would take the form of investment, and we would get securities in the public hands as investment. In your case, it's the opposite one, where the crisis is an opportunity to deplete a fund, which must be enlarged in good times, which again, it sort of makes sense coming from a context where, unlike the United States or Europe, the flexibility of the fisc is not as high, especially in a time of crisis. But part of the reason why in the developed world, for big crises, states have rainy day funds, but countries other than small countries tend not to, is because of the unfortunate correlation between crises large enough to interest those bodies that are effectively systematic and the performance of a sovereign wealth fund. If there's something like a global pandemic, for example, this one has been rather odd from a financial perspective, but one would expect during a global crisis that maybe a lot of different financial assets would devalue just when people would try to tap their rainy day funds. So for less global crises, if you're a small country, you might want the social wealth funds assets to be international, so they're less correlated with your domestic crisis, although there might be political impediments to that. So that's really the question I wanted to ask you. How do you see structuring these things, especially since systemic crisis is part of what you're after, so that they're there when you need them? They're not correlated out of these. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I had a very quick talk with someone who understands much better than I about those funds. And I asked a similar question. I said, well, like, what happens if we have funds that are based on, international assets and we have a global crisis? And I said, well, the same that happens if a meteor hits the earth. There's nothing to do. Like if a crisis is of that scale, then there's very little you can do. What you're trying to protect is something more, let's say, humble, in the sense of a local crisis or a small scale crisis in part of the country, in a city or in a region, and not really something catastrophic. Because in order to protect from a catastrophic measure such as that, then you probably need different mechanisms. I am more concerned about protecting against recessions. And in this sense, I see two things I'm not a specialist in funds, so don't take my word for this, but I see two things that we should be looking at. First, government bonds, because they usually will be sufficiently stable, while we have a government, and then international assets as well. You have to somehow compose a reasonable portfolio. But then again, I am not the person to discuss how to compose a portfolio of that type.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. And it's really a fascinating talk. Really appreciate it.
That said, I think it is a very important question. I just want to make sure that the fact that I don't have an answer does not make it less important. Actually, I think it is extremely important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, actually. And, I think this is something that we should all together be thinking about. But a really interesting kind of question and answer. So thank you for that, Steve. I see that Fabio has a question now. Would you like to introduce yourself, Fabio?
Okay, thank you, Paul. I'm Fabio Valtenberg. I work in Niterói in Brazil, and I'm working together with the JFI on this Maricá experiment. I have a question, Marcelo. We all here, I think we all agree that it's a great idea to create this, what you call operational infrastructure. It seems very wise, very interesting, and even I would say neutral from a political point of view.
Yeah,
right. It could be interesting for both.
That's part of the idea. The part of that, just to mention, part of the idea is to be neutral.
Yeah, but my question is, for example, if I think about right-wing or far right-wing politicians, such as the ones we have in Brazil right now, and policymakers and so on, would they be convinced of this idea of, creating and developing this operational infrastructure? And probably had such experience talking with the politicians or with some of, for example, these economists who are now proposing a kind of something like this rainy day scheme, but in terms of insurance, again, contributory. So Simon Schwarzman and Marcos Lisboa and Marcos Mendes and so on, they are proposing something which is for informal workers. They will have to pay something, to pay a kind of insurance in order to be eligible to receive these funds back. So about your experience on that and your thoughts. And thank you very much for the presentation.
Well, first, I cannot answer for Latin America because I am not a political analyst. So I don't really have a map of the political space that would be available for implementing such measures in Latin America. But I think they will, because first, I'm sure they should. And I think they will, because this does not involve high costs. Documental inclusion is almost for free. It's very cheap to issue documents and identify your population. I'm not saying free, but for a state, it's nothing. Then financial inclusion is becoming cheaper over the years, and actually of interest of private institutions like banks. They want to grab the share of the market, potentially the share of the market. So it's also totally feasible. It's a matter of taking the initiative much more than having a large budget to ensure that. And then comes the third one, which is promoting digital inclusion. Latin America already has the infrastructure. The physical infrastructure already exists. The coverage in Latin America for internet is very high. There are problems, but they're secondary in terms of our debate here. And there is a problem of equipment and so, but this is also the coverage of equipments, domestic equipments, people can use that in their households. That also is high, not extremely high, depends very much on the country, but it's also high, increasing and not so hard to solve. A problem that Latin Americans will face is the technical capacity to use, higher technologies, digital technologies. That, I agree, is a problem that has to be addressed. And maybe it will take longer, and maybe we will need some kind of secondary solutions. The main problem of internet access in Latin America today is the cost of access, because we have a private model. A private model in the sense that you have to pay for the data you use. And in order to pay for the data, the model we have, they have to buy a package, a data package. This makes no sense. Like if you want to call suppose you could get internet. If you want to call the police, you dial a toll-free number. But if you want to enter the website of the police, you have to pay for the data you're using. There's no sense. The technology for reverting that is so simple that it should be adopted immediately. Like we already have the technology of having reverse charging, or collect calling. Let's say it's not collect call because it does not use coins anymore. But anyway, we can reverse the charges very easily from the technological point of view. It's extremely simple to do. And the costs of data are extremely low. Like if the governments currently in Latin America use telephone centers, telemarketing centers to receive callers and provide services. The costs of data are much lower than that. That is cheap compared to having a government agency open, but data is even cheaper because you don't have a human at the other end of the line. So it's even cheaper and actually much more convenient for the user, because the user can do that Sunday morning. They can do that, in the middle of the night, something they wouldn't be able to do if they had to go to a physical agency, or if they had to make a call. They wouldn't be able to call, you know, the middle of the night, because usually those services are not 24/7, 24/7. All right. Okay. So I think, but then answering, you know, being objective and answering your question, I don't know. What I can tell you is that I discussed those measures within the Brazilian Congress, and they were received very well. But between being received and implemented, there is a long way. But they have been received very well, and essentially because they are very cheap, they are politically neutral, as you mentioned, and third, they have political return. You know, if you document a large share of your population, that costs you nothing, but you're going to show up in a campaign, say, whoa, I need all the citizens to come and be documented. So you got free airtime to do that. That's propaganda at the very end. That's, you know, being advertisement of your political abilities and so on and so forth. So I think there will be a tendency to receive that, and because of those three reasons.
Great. Well, I see we have one more question on the list here from Fernando, but I think now would be a great time also if anyone else had been, you know, sitting on a question. You know, it's kind of a last call. So as Fernando was asking his question, you know, just add in the chat. Otherwise, we will take this as our last one. So Fernando, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. So hello. Thanks for your presentation. I'm Fernando. I work with JFI at Marica Basic Income Evaluation, and I'd like to ask about the sovereign fund in Brazil. I'm thinking about how to create a sovereign fund in Brazil that could be useful, because we had the previous experience with the sovereign fund that was not useful. And how could we make it different now? Do you think it's having its independent status will be enough to make it work, or should I think with more measures to make it work better? Few institutional measures, for example. How do you see that?
Yeah, well, I don't have any specific design. I think this design would depend on the country. It depends on the legal framework of each country. And also, of course, it would depend on the legal framework of Brazil. And Brazil tried to create a fund. It didn't fail because it did create the fund. It just didn't feed the fund. You know, the fund is depleted, but they created the fund. So we're discussing two different problems here. One is to create a fund, to create a governance infrastructure, and then is to fill the fund with money. That's the secondary step. Of course, if you just create the fund, this fund is useless. You need to put money in the fund so you can use the fund. But those are two different steps. And one step depends more on technical decisions. The second one depends much more on political decisions. So putting money on a fund like this is the same thing as, okay, let's expand the expenditure in social assistance. Is it feasible? Yes. Did it work in the past? No. Can we do this in the future? Of course we can. It depends on political mobilization. That's a different story, but it's totally feasible. And of course, all the Latin American countries will have different types of problems, you know, different types of legal barriers. For instance, a very important problem in Latin America is it depends on your degree of federalism. You know, some states in Latin America are highly federal. Some states are highly centralized. Is the funds going to be federal or going to be federated? You know, accept, you know, different levels of the federation, using or influencing the use of the fund. Those discussions, they are very important. What I am sure is that having the fund is better than not having it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Marcelo. I think you know, it's now about it's been about an hour, so I think perhaps it makes sense for us to wind things down for the day, unless you have any concluding thoughts you would like to share. No?
Thank you. I like the questions. Made me think.
Yeah. I think it was a really vibrant discussion about, you know, such an important proposal. I think thinking more about infrastructure is so critical, and I mean, I really appreciate that was at the center of both your talk and the subsequent conversation. So thank you one last time, Marcelo, for this really fantastic presentation. and hope everyone has a great evening.